The brain itself, meaning the brain tissue, does not have any sensory neurons. What do I mean by that? Well, if I touch the top of my hand, I can feel that. If I want to sense my heartbeat, if I work at it, I can feel that. If I want to sense how I feel internally at the level of my stomach, is it full, is it empty, am I hungry, is it acidic, does it ache, or does it feel pleasant, etc., I can sense that. And that's because we have sensory neurons on our skin and in our body, etc. We also have sensory neurons in our eyes that let us perceive things externally. We have no sensory neurons on our brain. This is one of the reasons why you can remove the skull and do brain surgery on somebody who's wide awake and be poking around in there, and they don't need any anesthetic on the brain itself. They need anesthetic for the incision site, but they don't need anesthetic on the brain because it has no feeling. You have emotions, but there's no feeling. So normally we are perceiving and paying attention to what we are sensing, either externally, sights and sounds, again, exteroception, or internally, interoception, touch, etc. But by focusing our perception and our attention not on our bodily surface like a body scan, but to a point a couple centimeters or inches behind our forehead, we essentially are bringing that attentional, that perceptual spotlight to a location in which there is no sensation. There's nothing to feel there. And when we do that by closing our eyes and focusing on that quote unquote third eye center, which is the prefrontal cortex, to be quite honest, when we do that, something else happens. And what happens is when we are not thinking about and perceiving our sensations, because there are none there, our thoughts and our emotions and our memories sort of mushroom up. A better way to put it would be that they geyser up and take on more prominence in our perception. What I mean by this is that normally, I'm not thinking about the contact point between me and this chair, but as I'm speaking, I'm in contact with the chair and those neurons are firing. But if I focus my energy and attention on them, they're going to fire the same, but more of my perception goes there. Similarly, I'm thinking things all the time, you are too, and I'm perceiving things all the time, and I'm remembering things all the time, and I'm anticipating things all the time about the future. But by focusing my attention on the one organ for which I have no sensation, that is my brain, well then, thoughts, feelings, and memories, feelings meaning emotional feelings, start to grow in their prominence, in my awareness and in my perception. And so this is why when you sit down to a meditative practice, if it's a meditative practice where you close your eyes or you're focused on that third eye center, where you're focused on your brain as opposed to your bodily surface or something external to you, the thoughts seem to come by in waves and they can almost be overwhelming. It's very hard to, as it's often described, just sit back and watch your thoughts go by because there are so many of them. Actually, the best way to stop thinking is to really focus on something external or to focus on sensation. That's less thinking than it is perceiving senses. Okay, so I don't want this to get too abstract. When people talk about the third eye center, they're not talking about the pineal, they're talking about prefrontal cortex. And when you direct your own attention to the very area of your brain that directs attention, there's nothing to sense there. The only things that will become present to you are feelings, emotions, that is, thoughts, and memories. And they will often arrive in what seems to be a very disorganized fashion. And the reason they arrive in somewhat disorganized fashion is because normally we just don't perceive things that way. Normally we are splitting our attention, our perception that is, to multiple things, our sensation and our thoughts. When we put all of our perception into our thoughts, we see how disorganized, how wandering they are, and how random and intrusive those can be. Again, random and intrusive. And much of what we talked about in that paper earlier, the one where they asked people, what are you doing and what are you feeling and how happy or how unhappy you are? What they discovered was that most people are sort of in their head a lot. They're not really present to what they're doing, which leads me to the statement that I believe, at least based on the data, that paper included, that most people have an interoceptive bias. They're focused more on what's going on internally than they are focused on what's happening externally. There are certainly people who, for the opposite is true, but I think that this is an issue because we hear so often about the need to do a meditation practice that allows us to focus inward. and that we're getting yanked around by all the stressors of life, et cetera, et cetera. And we're getting yanked around by all the stressors and demands of life. But as we do that, we tend to be very focused on what's happening with us. The data clearly point to the fact that being mindful and being aware can enhance one's level of presence and happiness. But we can go so far as to say that being mindful and aware of what's happening, not just with us, but external to us in our immediate environment, that includes what other people are saying and doing, that also can really enhance our sense of well-being and happiness. At least that's what the data point to. Avoid cold immersion, so ice baths and being in cold water up to the neck, uncomfortably cold, within the 4 hours after a training session that's designed to evoke an adaptation, either endurance, hypertrophy, or strength, because the inflammation that you experience from a hard endurance workout or from a hard strength or a hard hypertrophy workout is the stimulus that you're going to adapt to. The cold water immersion reduces inflammation and can short circuit some of that. After 4 hours, you're probably okay, but if you can do it a different day or you can do it before those sessions, that's better. Heat, however, can be done immediately after training, and it's probably beneficial because of the way that it dilates the vascular system and perfuses the muscles and ligaments, et cetera, with more nutrients. Now, in terms of training, he has this beautiful 3x5 concept for strength. Pick 3 exercises, compound exercises, multi-joint movements. Do 3 to 5 exercises for 3 to 5 repetitions per set. Rest 3 to 5 minutes and do that 3 to 5 times per week. What's interesting about this is 3 to 5 times a week is a lot for a muscle group. Squatting 5 times a week for 5 reps, meaning you're working pretty heavy, meaning you're close to failure but not failure for strength generally. People who are training mostly for strength can do these low rep type regimens frequently because most of the adaptation is neural, and because you're not pushing to failure in most cases, you don't get that sore. And so it's the motor neurons getting the muscle fibers to contract more intensely or with more efficiency in other ways that's leading to these strength gains. And this is why powerlifters can train every day or 5 days a week or 4 days a week. For hypertrophy, I learned from Andy that the repetition range can be pretty broad. You're thinking anywhere from 6 to 30 repetitions. You should do 10 sets per muscle group per week, maybe even a bit more.
So high volume.
High volume, but you have to go to failure or beyond in order to stimulate growth. Why does it work at such a great range of repetitions? Well, there apparently are 3 ways that you stimulate hypertrophy, and maybe more. One is tissue micro damage to the tissue. The other is through some sort of tension-based changes in the molecular gene programs of cells that lead to protein synthesis that are distinct from damage. And the other are metabolic effects of like high repetition work of superfusion of the muscle with blood. We know that third category exists because people are now doing this blood restriction training where they cuff off a muscle and they'll use a really light weight. I've done these before. You can use a 5-pound weight and do curls with this, and you are in pain and the muscles are swelling up with blood. It does lead to hypertrophy, but in general, you're not sore, you're not doing tissue damage. And by the way, don't just tourniquet off a muscle because you have to use the proper cuffs because you need the blood still to flow in one direction. You can't just cinch it off, or you'll potentially kill yourself if you get a clot or you do it wrong. So get the appropriate cuffs. They're out there. And then for endurance, I learned something really cool. So I work out, basically, I go to the gym every other day on average. 3 or 4 days a week I do that, but generally not 2 days in a row. It's workout. Next day I'll do cardio. Next day. And the cardio for me is always a 30 to 45 minute jog, kind of zone 2 cardio. Andy informed me that to build endurance while building strength and maintaining some muscle size, or even building muscle size, I would be wise to take 1 day a week and add to that all out max heart rate work for 90 seconds at least. So do 90 seconds, then rest, and then maybe do another 90-second all out sprint. You run a mile, you ask yourself, how long did that take? Let's say it took 8 minutes. Then you walk or rest for 8 minutes. Then you run another mile as fast as you can, and then you rest for the equivalent period. And you do that 1 to 3 times once per week. And so as an all-around fitness program, you could collapse this into something where you say, okay, you're going to work out with the weights for about an hour every other day. Maybe take 2 days off every once in a while, maybe not. You're going to do 6 to 15 repetitions. You're going to push to failure on some of those, not all, because some of those are designed to build more strength. You're not going to failure and heavier. Some are designed for hypertrophy, higher rep, and going to failure. And then on off days, you're going to jog for 30 to 45 minutes. But for 2 days a week, you're either at the end of your jog or whatever, you're going to do some all-out sprints for 90 seconds and then rest and repeat. And for another day, you're going to do these mile repeats. That's a pretty large chunk of exercise movement. But if you kind of thread through the middle of all that, what you end up with is some decent strength building protocols, some decent hypertrophy, some cardiovascular training that establishes the so-called A base or a so-called base. So you're not going to get really good at anything. You're not going to become a marathoner this way, an optimizing marathon. You're not going to optimize powerlifting. You're not going to optimize hypertrophy. But for the typical person, 75% of people, 75% of the time, they want some muscle, they want some strength, they want some endurance, and they want the capacity to sprint to the security gate without, leaving a lung in the terminal.
So it's like functional.